Sajid Javid, in his speech when he talked about resigning, referenced a sermon. Sajid Javid, of course, until recently a minister in the Johnson government in the UK. He resigned, as indeed has Boris Johnson as party leader, which leads to him leaving as Prime Minister, but doesn't instantly do that. Now, Sajid Javid is from a Muslim background, although apparently not a practicing Muslim. He had been at the House of Commons parliamentary prayer breakfast that morning, and the preacher was the Reverend Les Isaacs, and he says, Beryl, that sermon changed his mind. It was that sparked him to resign from government. The subject of the sermon was integrity and humility, and quoted the verse Philippians 2 verse 8, being found in appearance as a man, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. The preacher went on to say, we are called to work together for the common good, not just for the party, not just for the denomination, but for humanity. So that's the thrust of the sermon. Now, what do we make of this? It sounds like it was quite a dynamic prayer meeting. I believe the Prime Minister was there as well. So what do you make of this?
I think it's quite striking, and maybe, since it seems to be that sermon that was the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, it was its effect on Sajid Javid, who became the first member of the cabinet to hand in his resignation because he couldn't take the lack of integrity anymore. Mm-hmm. And it started a wave of people in the cabinet who also handed in their resignations. I mean, Sajid Javid's resignation was swiftly followed by Rishi Sunak's resignation.
Yeah.
And it went from something like 18 people who had decided to do something about the situation to, I think, was round about 50 people on the same day who decided they couldn't stand the direction of the government any longer.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to that sermon, which was in the prayer breakfast that they have there. Andy Flanagan, who's a musician, I believe was there leading the worship, leading the singing. Mm-hmm. And he was leading the singing, the time of response to the sermon. Mm-hmm. And he says, during that moment, God's presence was irresistible. Do you think this was a moment where God's Holy Spirit directly influenced politicians?
I think so. I've been thinking about this, and I have actually commented before that sometimes situations can come to an impasse and God's Spirit can break in on a situation and affect it for good. We sometimes wonder in the world today, and particularly in this country, where Christianity is going. Mm-hmm. Where is its influence? What has happened? How can we influence the country for good? And sometimes it comes to the point where human beings are helpless, but for God.
Yes. Sorry to harp on about the actual meeting, but just sort of place ourselves there. I know many of our listeners will be in this sort of prayer meeting or service where there's been a sermon, there's a build-up to the sermon, then you normally have music surrounding it. Music is a very useful aspect of worship in that it can relax you and open you up. Personally, I prefer a bit more silence in services, which I think is also very effective. But one interesting thing, and I think that you'd be interested in this especially, Beryl, as you lead a show each Sunday in which there's music played and there's worship through music there. What songs are actually being sung in the prayer meeting? And I've got them here. They sang the hymn, Lord for the Years.
Yeah, it's a very good hymn written by, I'm just trying to remember, I've got it on the tip of my tongue.
Timothy Dudley-Smith.
That's right, that's the one I was thinking of.
Now, when was he around?
He was a bishop, mid-20th.
Oh, really, that late? Well, here are some of the words. Lord, for our land, in this our generation, spirits oppressed by pleasure, wealth and care. Lord, for our world, when we disowned and doubt him, loveless in strength, comfortless in pain. Lord, for ourselves, in living power, remake us.
Yes.
It's quite, they are
very powerful
very
words.
Powerful words. So now they're calling for change in the world, a different way of looking at it, but also talking about our land.
Yeah.
the place that we live. Often this is forgotten, the emphasis in the Bible on the land where you live. When you welcome strangers, there's an emphasis on you welcome strangers to your land. It's not like you don't have any land. You can own land. And if you're a nation there, that's your land, your nation. And in doing so, you're then able to be generous to others. Whereas if you don't own anything, you don't have anything, so you can't be generous. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of political thought, this seems to be forgotten. So that's actually making a very big political statement. Our land.
Yes, I was very struck yesterday that the liturgical readings for yesterday, it was the 5th Sunday after Pentecost. One of the readings was from Luke chapter 10 about Good Samaritan. Mm-hmm. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is recorded in Luke's Gospel, there was a man going down a lonely road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and
he's beset by thieves. Yes.
And he was robbed and left for dead. And two people passed him by. The first one was a priest. The second one was a Levite. Mm-hmm. We can become so obsessed by our Christian culture. We can be like the priest. This person who has been left for dead is not of our culture. He's not Christianized. Mm-hmm. So we pass by on the other side. But very often we need to go to those people who we would not normally touch or address or help, because they are not like us.
Yeah.
But Jesus came for the people who are not like us.
Interesting about that passage is that he is asked, who is my neighbour? And as Jesus often does, he answers a different question. A bit like a politician say, well, the question you should be asking is this, and then make a different point. It's not that he doesn't answer the question at all. He answers either an opposite question or a related question. So he is asked, who is my neighbour? And he answers it with, here's how to be a good neighbour. Mm-hmm. So he puts a different twist on it. You shouldn't be asking, well, who is the good neighbour? The only way to be a good neighbour is through your actions, through what you do. Mm-hmm. And so going back to the political point that you could make, we could have a sermon from that to the politicians. It's about caring for the people, whoever they are, whatever their background, that's true. But you don't identify who's a good neighbour by who they are, who their family is, or that sort of thing. You instead give up identifying who's a good neighbour and try and be a good neighbour yourself. So in terms of politics for Britain, how should we behave as Britain? Well, we should, instead of trying to corral the world into behaving how we think they should, make them into good neighbours. We should clean up our own house first and be good neighbours to our friends in Europe and around the world who we trade with. We should be honest and have integrity. So I think that would be a good sermon for them too.
Yes, I noticed that the Reverend Les Isaacs, who gave the sermon, he leads and initiated the project Street Pastors.
Yeah, I believe so.
And my goodness me, if ever there were people who are not like us, it is the people that we meet on the streets at night.
Yes.
And in fact, I don't meet them because I don't go out at night.
No, I tend not to be on the streets in the middle of the night because I've got a house to go to, but I suppose many people don't. But people choose to be out at that time. There's lots of very different subcultures within Britain, and it's not true to say that all cultures are the same, even within subcultures within Britain. Some are very harmful and destructive to the people who are part of it. And there's an element of that in the sort of street culture. Alternative lifestyle type culture, all of which tend to be destructive to the people who take part. You know, there's illicit drug taking, there's tattooing, which is just a very risky business, having a tattoo, even if it's a great tattoo parlour, and strange or abnormal sexual behaviour. All of this are their own sort of subculture.
That's the culture of drinking, of course. I
didn't mention drinking alcohol to excess as a subculture because it's almost like the dominant culture in Britain, isn't it? The main one is drink too much alcohol. The subculture is take illicit drugs. And they have something in common. There's good and bad in all of them, of course. There's mixture with these different cultures. And within a different culture, there's still people. So you could say, well, you can be mixing with a group of really hardened drug addicts whose life revolves around that if they're real enthusiasts or really addicted, depending how you look at it. But they'll still have their own little language and slang that they'll have jokes together. They'll have people who are their favourites, and they're still people, and so you're still able to connect. These street pastors are still able to connect at a human level and bring God's love to them in that practical way. So I think he was a very good person to be preaching to politicians, practical help and love. Yeah, Norman, what do you make of this?
Part of the article on the web from Christianity Today says, is this the sermon that brought down a government? And I would say it wasn't. I don't think Les Isaacs, when he prepared the sermon, thought, right, I am going to preach this sermon and it's going to make a change in the government. I think he probably, I'm sure he sought as to what God wanted him to say, but somehow or other, God broke in to that meeting. And that is what brought down the government.
Yes.
I encourage people to pray. You encourage people to pray for things on the radio. You do, Peter. And we say to people, pray about this world situation, pray about that. And we don't necessarily know how God is going to answer that prayer. And God sometimes answers prayers in a very strange, unexpected way. It was great that there were that a number of people. It was great that the sermon made people think and turn their minds towards God. And I'm sure that the bit of music at the end added to that and helped to form up people's thoughts towards God. The fact that they had to turn their phones off, which I just haven't done, and the fact that it was quiet, it was a break and so on. But God broke through. And it was one of those times when perhaps, yes, God said, I'm going to put my stamp upon a particular situation and it's going to change a nation. And God broke through. And perhaps it encourages us when we are praying to actually say, God, we're not going to tell you how or what, but we want you to break into this situation and to bring a change. And perhaps thinking very much about Ukraine, perhaps thinking very much about Sri Lanka, perhaps thinking very much about Japan, world situations at the moment, thinking very much about the poor and the difficulties that people are facing, that God will actually break through. And I'm sure that Les Isaacs was grateful that God in some way used him. And that's the best we can do, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's the best we can do. I don't want to minimise the importance of preaching and preparation for preaching and the prayer that went into it. But often God uses your sermons, I found as a preacher myself, in ways that you didn't intend, especially as if you're simply highlighting what it says in Scripture. So there's already the deep meaning there, but you bring it out, and that can have a tremendous effect. I think this preaching, declaring the words, very important. It's part of what we're told to do, and certain people are called to do it. I like this Les. His sermon was used by God, it seems, to do this. I would argue that, I know technically the government is under the leadership of the Prime Minister, but they haven't brought down the government. There's still going to be Tories there. Has it brought down the government? No, they're just changing Prime Minister. That might be a response. What difference is that going to make? And it could make a difference if you have a different leader. So let's just have a brief look at who should be the leader. Not necessarily naming names, although we can do that if you want, Beryl. But what sort of person? Who do we want to be in place? Do we want, for example, a Christian? Would it be better if there were a Christian leading the country? We pray, I pray regularly for God's wisdom to be given to people who are leaders. Now, that's more likely to be the case because they'll be praying for themselves and consciously attempting to follow God's wisdom, the God of the Bible, the God whom we believe in, his wisdom, if you're a Christian. So it's not the label Christian, it's the actual being an active Christian that's important. Is it important, do you think, Beryl, for us to have a Christian as our Prime Minister?
I think it depends whether they wear their Christianity on their sleeve and say, it's because I'm a Christian that I do this.
Oh. Is that good or bad, do you think? If they say, it's because I'm a Christian they do this, is that good or bad?
I don't know. I think it depends really on the circumstances and so on. I mean, Theresa May, the media showed her going to church.
She identifies as a Christian, yeah.
She identified as being a Christian, and yet she was obliged in the end to resign. And
she did a terrible job at the task in hand there of negotiating leaving the EU.
Yes.
That's what they recognise.
Being a Christian doesn't make you a good Prime Minister.
No, but if you were a good Prime Minister material and a Christian, would that be better?
I think so. Again, going back to the liturgical theme, God's word is righteous even when we don't like it.
Yes.
And clearly there are many people who know what God has to say in his book, the Bible, but very often they don't like what he says for various reasons, because it overrides their personality.
Now, are there any Christians amongst the contenders for the new leadership? Well, some of the major contenders are either not Christian, they're not of any faith, such as Boris Johnson, or they're of other faiths. Rishi Sunak is a Hindu, I believe, and Suella Braverman, who is one of the candidates, she is Buddhist. But we have Kemi Badenoch, who was the Minister for Local Government, Faith and Communities. So she'd know about faith. And she was part of the government's liaison for countries' faith leaders. Well, she describes herself as a cultural Christian, so sort of Christian. Her grandfather was a Methodist minister, but she also has, a grandfather who was a Muslim. But she is married to a Catholic. So you would say that she's a cultural Christian and has Christian influence. Okay. The other chap who I have in mind is Tom Tugendhat. He's also thrown his hat into the ring. He is Catholic. Roman Catholicism just does have big differences, which I'm not minimising, but as I've included a cultural Christian, I think I can include a Catholic under the large umbrella Christian. Is that a good thing?
I'd also like to mention Steve Baker.
He hasn't put his
hat in the ring.
Well, I understand that he made a statement supporting Suella Braverman. So we don't have any actual born-again Christians. Would that make a difference? Now, the reason I'm asking this, particularly now, is we have that moment when there was a sermon where God's presence was felt, and it made a change in the way that certainly Sajid Javid operated. How about having a Prime Minister who has a daily quiet time, maybe with some worship, praying and reading the Bible? Might he not also receive wisdom from God in that moment? God's Holy Spirit directly gives him wisdom. That would be a good thing, though, wouldn't it?
Yes. Although I'm a little suspicious of people who say that they are Christian, that they read the Bible, they pray, and so on. The Bible will encourage us to be people of action also, that our actions show what we believe.
I guess what I'm saying is someone who genuinely does that.
Yes.
Of course, you can do that and then ignore it.
It's a bit more difficult to do if you're actually living the life by action.
Yes, true, yes.
Just saying.
Yeah, and I think that is the biblical principle. By your fruits shall you know them.
That's right.
You can tell by the way people act whether they're actually genuinely following God's ways. But at least there's a chance that they will do that, rather than someone who, like Boris Johnson, who completely ignores most of the Ten Commandments. Quite a few of them he's ignored. And so we've had someone who hasn't been a Christian in position. Do we need someone who's different? Well, I don't know how many Christians have been Prime Minister. Theresa May certainly said she was a Christian. Going back, I guess it was more difficult that people would say they were Christian. Churchill famously said he supports the Church of England like a buttress. He supports them, but from the outside.
I've been reading quite a bit about Henry Herbert Asquith lately, and apparently he was brought up very strongly in a cultural Christian atmosphere, let's say. His parents were very much involved in bringing him up in a Christian lifestyle. But as he grew into his 20s and so on, he wanted to repudiate that.
Yeah, it's interesting that as a Christian country, certainly in the past, some people saying it's becoming less Christian, still officially a Christian country, we've had remarkably few actual believing Christians who were prime ministers, at least in recent years. So maybe that's an issue, that's something to pray about, certainly. But certainly someone of integrity is someone that I think we've been missing.
Yes, someone who believes his word is his bond. Someone who believes in carrying out what he says.
Now,
or she, of course.
Yes, so know just briefly who we would want to take on the reins as being Prime Minister, assuming Boris Johnson doesn't put his hat back in the ring and say he wants to challenge for his own position, which he's at liberty to do. Is there anyone who strikes you as being a good candidate of the people who have named themselves? Maybe there's someone who springs to mind, Beryl, or isn't there anyone?
Tom Tugend's hat I'm interested in.
Tom Tugend is a Catholic, he's an ex-army officer type.
Also, you have the name on the tip of my tongue. Penny Mordaunt, I'm interested in. I don't know where she is from a spiritual point of view.
Penny Mordaunt, very pro-Brexit. And that's an argument in their favour because the government has, at least officially, been trying to carry out fully the leaving of the EU and take advantage of Britain's new position, although it's been pointed out ad nauseum that Boris Johnson's government never actually did that. So if you've got someone who is a strong Brexiteer, a strong supporter of Brexit in position, you could see that being sorted out. And so you've got Penny Mordaunt, she's a supporter of Brexit now. Yeah, she was very strong during the campaign on Brexit. And so you've got those two strong women candidates who could be the next... Well, we had a man last time. Let's have a woman this time. Why not? We could alternate, right? One before.
Rather like the Archbishop of Canterbury being a Liberal or a Conservative.
Supposedly, that's what they did, yes.
Yeah.
So we've got those two. So no one else spring to mind as a good candidate? I mean, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor for some time right through the pandemic times. At least have experience. Does that count for anything?
And I think experience is very important. Unfortunately, I think Rishi Sunak would need to involve themselves in double taxation relief. International tax status has been questioned in the last few days. Yes,
there's problems with their integrity as regarded in that place. The biggest problem that I see, this is from my particular political stance on events over the last few years up to date, is there are two big issues on which they all seem to be on the same side, and I'm on the opposite side. Although I would say I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, I'm not a member of any of the major political parties, I'm a member of a few smaller ones just so they get my fee, and I get their newsletter. But I'm not a member of any of the big parties, Conservative or Labour. No, I'm not a member. But I'm certainly conservative in terms of political thought.
So a small C.
Yeah, politically. And I suppose religiously as well, in that, I stick to the historic faith in the creeds and this sort of thing, and traditional morality and that sort of thing. But two big issues recently, where all of them are on the same side. One is the COVID response, introduces vaccines. They were all part of that, and in fact think they've been a great success. And the lockdowns, which have traumatised a whole generation of young people, trashed the economy, especially with the furlough payments, and resulted in huge amounts of debt for the country. All of them were in favour of all this. So none of them really, as I can see, are going to make a change that's worth a jot.
Okay.
So that's only one of them. I promised you two. The response to Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine. Immediately, we see the American government luring Putin into coming into Ukraine and then stirring up the response from Ukraine and pushing for there to be a conflict. We should have stood out against that, said, no, immediately negotiate, just stop. I don't see anyone changing that, even though President Zelensky from Ukraine has spoken out about how supportive he is of Boris Johnson because he's been a good friend. Yeah. But I don't see anyone standing out against that either. So these two big issues of the time, I think history will look back very unkindly on them. And they're live issues today. They could bring us back into lockdown.
Not likely to be solved very soon. So I suppose we shall see over the coming weeks what develops as the front runners and riders.
Yes, we're going to get someone in that place.
Yes.
And I suspect, because there's a group of MPs who decide then who are the two that the whole of the Conservative Party are allowed to vote for, I think the more outlandish candidates, the ones that I might prefer, are going to be removed. And it's probably going to be, I'll give a prediction, I don't know if you want to go, I would say more than likely it's going to be Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss.
I won't try and argue against that. I think it's very possible.
And my answer to that is, could we have neither?
We can't have no one.
I guess not. Could the Queen take over? please.
I think that would be the finish of her.
Just to go back to my 2 points that I was making, that they were both on the same side of. Each of those two, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, are great examples of the 2 different things that I disagree with. Rishi Sunak, of course, heavily into lockdowns, paying people out and that sort of thing, the bit that I was talking about. You can't blame him for the vaccines, so, although he is part of the government that did it. But the lockdowns and ridiculous furlough payments that kept people doing nothing for a long time has put this country into hock. And then Liz Truss, of course, what we sometimes call a hawk, really pro-war. She seems to love it and seems to keep pushing for more and more. We're not technically at war with Russia, just to remind you, but Liz Truss has been behaving as though we are.
Right.
So of the 2, I guess I prefer Rishi Sunak of the 2. I don't want a big war.
No, and you don't mind paying more tax, presumably.
Yeah, I do. I mind paying more tax. But of the 2, I go for no war.
Right.
Go on, settle for Penny Mordaunt, Peter.
I don't think Penny Mordaunt is going to be the 2 that they put forward. Penny Mordaunt, I suppose she might be second on the list that I would like.
She certainly has more recent cabinet experience.
Yes, yeah. But Penny Mordaunt also spoke very strongly in the debates on Brexit. But she's also, against what I believe, has spoken very strongly for the alphabet people. LGBTQ plus minus ampersand squared.
Right.
By those people, of course, we don't really actually mean gay and lesbian people. You mean people who are politically gay and lesbian. That's it.
Yes.
Socially, I would say not in favour of her, but because of her strong support for Brexit, I'd go with her. But she's not going to be in that position, you see. That no one would be. I don't believe they're going to be given a vote on that. I think they'd be the big beasts, as they say. Some people who are already names. And the other problem they have is, without Boris Johnson, they don't have a big name.
No.
If you ask someone in the public, what do you think of Penny Mordaunt? They would say, well, it sounds like she's got rather a sad name. Yeah. But apart from that, I don't think anyone will know who she is.
No, I think that's a problem.
Rishi Sunak, they might, because the old Dishy Rishi stuff from the lockdown days, because he's quite slim and fit chap. And he was doling out money. I mean, what's not to like? It'd be interesting to do a survey. Perhaps we could ask our listeners now, of these people, list the names of the people, and just say to your friends and relatives, don't say what it's about, name some of these names. See if people say, oh yes, well I think that their politics are rubbish, or whatever, or they say they're brilliant. But if they say, who? Well, you got your answer, yeah, but you haven't got any big names. I think more than likely that will be the answer. Yeah. So there we are. We've had a brief discussion now of the leadership of the Tory party competition, which is especially trenchant because at this moment the leader of the Tory, the Conservative Party, will become Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and territories. As we've been discussing it, we've been talking about how Christianity, belief in God, is involved. And at least one person was influenced by a sermon of all things. So just as we close out this, what sort of role are preachers to take in this, their role? So should sermons up and down the land be commenting more on politics from the biblical point of view?
I will be interested to see what the results will be if they did. How much people will be influenced by involving politics in faith. In
my sermons, which tend to be, the churches where I minister, so Church of England churches, I tend to go so far as to say in the sermon, if I discuss politics at all, that I'm not taking a political side. And I mentioned the fact that I just said that I'm not a member of a major political party. I can exclusively reveal that one of the minor parties I am a member of is the Christian People's Alliance.
Right.
Now, the
they mainly figure in London, don't they?
In terms of people actually voted into position, they don't really figure much anywhere, I have to admit. So they're in the south mainly, and they joined in with other Christian parties, but they have interests around the country. They'd like to be bigger, and they have obviously a specific Christian out. And so, for example, on certain social issues like abortion, they're in line with what I think. So if there were to be a sermon on abortion in an American church, for example, it would be possible to say, and therefore vote Republican. If you were pro-abortion, you could say, and therefore vote Democrat. You've actually got political parties that take different stances on this thing.
Yeah.
Whereas apart from, a minor party like Christian People's Alliance, which would take a stand against abortion, you don't have any major political parties which are against it. They're all for it.
Yes, unfortunately.
So we've talked about that at length. I just chose that as an issue. And so if you got people in sermons preaching up and down the land, and they do influence people, such as Sajid Javid was influenced, maybe we'll get people from all political parties being influenced, maybe even choosing to take a stance that's in line with the Bible.
Mm-hmm. It would be difficult in our area in which we live and move, which is the Merseyside area, because they are so heavily weighted towards Labour.
Yes, it would be very difficult. We were in a very strange area here, Liverpool and surrounding areas. Very heavily Labour, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say something political, which is, however, widely known in the area. It's sort of that the Labour, but it's more like a Labour mafia, in that the politics is so corrupt around here. It has so much power because of that it perpetuates the brand Labour, even if they're not actually enacting policies that help the working people or what's become the underclass of non-working people. So if anyone does preach against the Labour Party in this area, then what stance would people take? Well, if you were just like I would, just criticising the corruption, I think you get a lot of support. But if you were saying, well, no, we should be more in favour of the Tories, then you might lose some of your congregation. But at the moment, I see no reason, for me anyway, to be pro-Conservative. But I'm certainly not pro-Labour either. So it's not that I'm taking a middle road. It's just that there are so many issues in which the major political parties have policies which go against what it teaches in the Bible. I don't see how I could possibly wholeheartedly support any of them.
Yes, I can understand that. I'm not a member of any political party either, but I usually vote Conservative. Because I just think Labour is so deplorable.
Okay, yes. Right, there I was being quite careful about what I said. You got it. Yes, well, at the last election, I voted for the Brexit Party.
Right.
I can say a pox on all their houses, because the Brexit Party doesn't exist anymore. So I didn't vote for either of the major parties, or indeed any of the others. I voted Brexit Party, but a Labour politician got in. The area where I live was for many, many years Conservative, but it has, and equally now for many years, being Labour. And so there we are, we're in this position where we can pray for our politicians, but we don't really have a political party that supports issues, from a biblical point of view.